Jackson Carter asked for $120 to replace a small safety valve inside the hydraulic system of the Langford private jet. Amelia Langford, the icy young chief executive, called him a poor mechanic chasing attention, then signed a $12 million upgrade contract in front of the executive board. The next morning, the jet still refused to start. As furious investors gathered and Jackson prepared to be fired, the doors opened and Amelia's father walked in, set a check for $120 million on the table, and spoke one sentence that silenced the room for good. The private airfield outside Savannah, Georgia, shimmered under early light as ground crews wheeled the Langford L-900 jet from its hangar. The aircraft belonged to Langford Aviation, a company built across 4 decades by a man who once slept in a maintenance bay rather than miss a deadline. Today the plane was meant to prove something larger than itself, a flying argument for investors who had grown uneasy after the company lost 2 major contracts in a single quarter. Amelia Langford moved through the hangar like a woman who had rehearsed every step in advance. At 31, she carried her father's company on shoulders that refused to show strain, dressed in tailored navy, her voice clipped and exact. The demonstration flight scheduled for the following morning would either restore confidence in Langford stock or confirm the doubts already spreading through the industry. She had no room left for anything that looked unfinished. Connor Blake, the operations director, intercepted her near the boarding stairs with a tablet already open. A secondary hydraulic line was throwing intermittent warnings, he explained, and the internal engineering team had not yet isolated the cause. He recommended bringing in outside help immediately, someone who had handled the airline's older systems before any of the newer staff had been hired. The name that came up was Jackson Carter, a contract technician who had quietly solved a string of difficult mechanical problems for Langford over the years without ever asking for recognition. He arrived in a faded work truck with 200,000 miles behind it, wearing a uniform shirt softened by years of washing, carrying a single metal toolbox that had belonged to his father. Office staff glanced at him the way people glance at something that does not belong in a glossy lobby. Jackson said little as he climbed into the service bay beneath the aircraft. He pressed 2 fingers against a hydraulic line, listened to the rhythm of the pump, and watched a barely visible tremor along one secondary valve. He worked the way men work who learned their trade with their hands rather than in a classroom, patient, unhurried, entirely focused on what the metal was telling him. Within 20 minutes he had his answer. A single safety valve worth $120 had begun sticking from microscopic metal shavings lodged inside its seat. Replacing it and recalibrating the pressure by hand would take less than 40 minutes. Lucas Bennett, the young lead engineer assigned to shadow him, stared at his own ignored sensor logs and realized Jackson's diagnosis matched data the internal team had dismissed 3 days earlier. Connor reacted instantly, calling the suggestion far too modest for a company about to host international investors. He argued that a $120 fix would look careless on paper, regardless of whether it worked, and that Langford needed something that photographed like progress. Jackson did not argue. He simply repeated that the failure point was isolated, not systemic, and that replacing the entire hydraulic cluster would solve nothing the valve could not solve alone. Amelia watched the exchange from a glass-walled office above the hangar floor, arms folded, jaw tight. She did not yet know who Jackson Carter was beyond a name on a contractor list. All she saw was a man in worn clothing proposing to patch a multi-million-dollar aircraft with a part that cost less than her lunch that week, and the sight of it made something in her tighten with irritation rather than curiosity. By the time Connor returned to the office with an alternative proposal, a full hydraulic cluster replacement priced at $12 million, Amelia was already inclined to agree. The number sounded like confidence. It sounded like a company that did not cut corners. Jackson remained below, quietly studying the schematic of the small valve no one else in that room had bothered to notice, already sensing that the decision being made above him was about to go badly wrong. The emergency meeting convened in the executive room overlooking the hangar floor, glass walls turning the entire scene into a kind of stage. Amelia sat at the head of the table, flanked by Connor, Madison Vale from legal, Lucas, and a row of senior directors who had learned to say very little when the founder's daughter looked tense. Connor presented the $12 million upgrade as a solution worthy of the Langford name, layering technical language meant to impress rather than inform. He spoke of redundancy, of modernized architecture, of a system that would never again raise a single warning light. The directors nodded along, soothed by the size of the number rather than by anything it actually solved. Jackson was asked to explain his alternative. He kept his answer short and plain. The aircraft did not need a new hydraulic system, only a single safety valve that had jammed from microscopic metal shavings. A few people in the room laughed quietly at the figure of $120, treating it as a kind of joke rather than a diagnosis. Amelia asked which prestigious aviation school had trained him. Jackson answered that his training came from military maintenance work and from years spent solving real failures on real aircraft, not from a classroom with his name on a wall. The answer did nothing to soften her doubt. If anything, the absence of an impressive resume made her trust him even less in a room full of people who valued polish above proof. Connor seized the opening, warning that if the company followed a contractor's hunch and the plane failed mid-flight, journalists would describe Langford Aviation as a business that repaired its jets with spare parts from a hardware store. Jackson repeated, without raising his voice, that the issue was never about the price of a part, only about choosing the correct one. Amelia's patience thinned to nothing. In front of the entire board, she declared that Langford would not gamble its future on what she called a $120 patch. She signed the $12 million contract with the vendor Connor had recommended, her pen moving with the finality of someone closing a door. Jackson was escorted out of the restricted technical area. His access badge was deactivated before he reached the elevator. Lucas wanted to speak up, to mention the data that matched Jackson's theory, but Connor's earlier warning about loyalty kept the words lodged in his throat. He watched in silence as Jackson packed his toolbox without complaint. Before leaving, Jackson set the old valve, sealed in a small plastic bag and clearly labeled, into Lucas's hand. He said quietly that if the aircraft still failed to start, someone should check that exact location again. Amelia overheard the remark from across the room and chose not to respond, certain it was nothing more than wounded pride speaking. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall over the airfield. Jackson walked to his truck without looking back, while behind him, inside the brightly lit hangar, a team of engineers began disassembling a multi-million-dollar system in pursuit of a problem far smaller than any of them yet understood. He sat for a long moment behind the wheel before starting the engine, not out of anger, but out of the quiet fatigue of a man who had grown used to being right in rooms that preferred confidence over evidence. He thought briefly of the long drive home, of the modest apartment waiting at the end of it, of the small voice that would ask how his day had gone. He had learned not to carry frustration through his own front door, and tonight would be no different. Whatever Langford Aviation decided to do with its money was no longer his concern, or so he told himself as the rain thickened against the windshield and the lights of the hangar shrank in his mirror. That night, Langford Aviation moved against the clock. Technicians from the outside vendor arrived with crates of new equipment, while internal communications were quietly instructed to say nothing of the sudden overhaul taking place inside the hangar. Floodlights burned until well past midnight, casting long shadows across an aircraft being taken apart and rebuilt in a single frantic sprint. Connor projected confidence at every turn, reminding Amelia repeatedly that her decision was the right one, that investors needed to see a company willing to spend boldly rather than patch quietly. Amelia nodded along, though a faint unease sat beneath her composure, one she refused to acknowledge even to herself. She stood at the edge of the work area, watching strangers dismantle a system that had functioned in one form or another for years. Lucas found a private moment to examine the old valve Jackson had left behind. Under a small light, he discovered exactly what Jackson had described, a fine residue of metal shavings lodged where the seal should have closed cleanly. He started toward Connor's office to report it, certain this detail mattered, but Connor intercepted him in the corridor before he reached the door. Connor's warning was sharp and immediate. He told Lucas not to undermine the chief executive's decision with what he called a poor mechanic's theory, reminding him whose signature carried weight in that building and whose did not. Lucas folded the bag back into his pocket and said nothing further, though the unease in his chest did not leave him for the rest of the night. By morning, the hangar had transformed into something closer to a stage set than a workspace. Investors arrived in dark cars, trailed by aviation journalists eager for a story about Langford's bold reinvestment in its fleet. Senior executives lined the floor in pressed suits, coffee in hand, rehearsing the language of confidence they would use throughout the day. Amelia climbed a small temporary platform to address the gathered crowd, speaking of innovation, of reliability, of a company unwilling to settle for outdated thinking. Behind her, the Langford L900 gleamed under the lights, polished to a shine that suggested nothing inside it had ever failed at all. It looked for a moment like exactly the symbol of power she had intended it to be. When the pilot attempted the first system startup, the control panel flashed a hydraulic warning instead of a clean confirmation. A second attempt produced the same failure. By the third attempt, the system locked itself into a protective shutdown, refusing to proceed any further no matter how many times the sequence was repeated. The mood inside the hangar shifted from polished confidence to visible unease within seconds. Investors exchanged glances. Journalists began writing in small notebooks, their pens moving faster than anyone on stage would have liked. Connor immediately blamed the internal engineering team for the failure, then, almost casually, suggested that Jackson Carter may have tampered with something the day before out of resentment. Amelia felt her face burn with a mixture of anger and humiliation she had rarely experienced in public. She ordered someone to call Jackson back, not out of any wish to apologize, but because she needed urgently to confront him directly about what had gone wrong. Jackson, miles away in a small repair shop on the edge of town, received the call with visible reluctance. The memory of yesterday's dismissal still sat heavily in his chest, and for a moment he considered simply declining. A brief call from home reminded him, gently, that steady work mattered more than wounded pride, though it did nothing to erase the sting of how he had been treated. He drove back to Langford Aviation, but this time he walked through the hangar doors without lowering his eyes, past hundreds of stares ranging from confusion to open suspicion. Amelia met him near the base of the aircraft, her voice cold and clipped as she issued her challenge. If he believed himself right, she told him he would have to prove it here now, in front of everyone who had just watched her promise fail. Amelia gave Jackson exactly 30 minutes to find the failure. If he was wrong, she told him in front of everyone, he would never work with any company connected to Langford again. Jackson understood immediately that this was not an invitation to help, but a public trial staged for an audience that had already half decided his guilt. Connor moved quickly to limit what Jackson could touch, insisting that he not be allowed near the new system without an engineer supervising every motion. Madison stood nearby with a tablet, documenting each decision carefully, aware that the company's legal exposure was growing by the minute. Tension filled the hangar like static before a storm. Jackson did not rush. He asked first to see the pressure logs recorded during the 12 hours following the upgrade installation. Engineers from the vendor smirked at the request, certain that a $12 million system could not possibly be defeated by a part that cost a fraction of a single hour of their labor. What Jackson found in the data was unmistakable. After the expensive overhaul, the failure still appeared at precisely the same pressure point as before, which meant the true cause had never actually been addressed, only buried beneath layers of new and unrelated hardware. He asked permission to remove an access panel on the right side of the secondary compartment. Connor objected immediately, arguing that the panel sat outside the boundaries of the recent upgrade. Jackson answered simply that this was exactly why the failure remained, because nothing within that overlooked section had ever been touched. Amelia, aware that every investor in the room was watching her decide, reluctantly allowed the panel to be opened. Behind it sat a small valve, tucked deep enough that almost no one had thought to examine it. Jackson explained that the valve was partially stuck, sending a false pressure reading to the new system and triggering its protective shutdown each time. It was the kind of failure invisible to anyone looking for a large, expensive cause. Connor dismissed the explanation as guesswork dressed up as certainty. Jackson responded by retrieving the original valve Lucas had kept safe, pointing to the fine metal residue and the matching wear pattern that lined up exactly with what he had described the day before. The evidence sat plainly in his open palm for anyone willing to look. Lucas finally found the courage to speak. He confirmed, in front of Amelia and the assembled directors, that Jackson had identified this same issue a full day earlier, and that the data supporting it had been available the entire time. Amelia turned to look at Lucas, then at Connor, and for the first time sensed that something had been deliberately concealed from her. Even with that realization beginning to form, she was not yet ready to apologize to Jackson in front of the investors still watching from across the hangar. Pride, even cracking pride, did not surrender easily in a room full of cameras and notebooks. Jackson broke the silence himself, stating plainly that he could get the aircraft running again, but only under two conditions. He needed full access to make the necessary repairs without interference, and he needed a guarantee that no one would later place blame on the junior technicians who had simply been following orders from above them. Before Amelia could answer, the side door of the hangar swung open. David Langford, founder of the company and Amelia's father, walked in with the unhurried gait of a man who had once built this entire operation with his own hands. He rarely intervened directly anymore, having stepped back from daily operations years earlier to let his daughter lead, and his presence alone silenced every conversation in the room. He did not look at Connor, nor at the investors clustered near the platform. His eyes went straight to Jackson, studying him for a long moment as though confirming something he had long suspected. He asked quietly whether Jackson remembered the old Langford L700 from years before. Jackson answered that he did because his own father had once worked on the maintenance crew for that very aircraft. The mention caught Amelia off guard. She had never known that Jackson carried any connection to the company's early history, let alone one that predated her own time at its helm. David explained that long ago, Jackson's father had quietly saved an early prototype from disaster using a solution so small that almost no one in leadership believed it could work. He said Jackson's instincts mirrored his father's exactly. The instinct to repair the smallest broken thing rather than replace the most expensive one. It was a rare gift, he said, and one this company had nearly thrown away twice now. Connor's composure began to slip as David spoke, sensing that the story being told in front of investors was slowly dismantling the version of events he had constructed. He shifted on his feet, glancing toward the exit as though calculating how much longer he could remain in the room without drawing further attention. David reached into his coat and produced a check made out for $120 million, setting it down on a small rolling table positioned where everyone could see it. He announced that this was not a simple reward, but a personal investment in an independent maintenance company Jackson would found, contingent on Jackson agreeing to become a strategic partner of Langford Aviation going forward. The hangar fell completely silent. Amelia stared at the check, struggling to reconcile the number with the man she had publicly humiliated less than a day earlier. It seemed almost impossible that her own father was offering this kind of trust to someone she had dismissed so easily in front of the entire board. David delivered the line that would echo through the company for months afterward, telling the room that any executive could learn the price of an upgrade, but only a rare few ever learned to recognize the value hiding inside a small, overlooked failure. Jackson did not reach for the check right away. He said the aircraft needed to be fixed first because the dignity of the people who worked with their hands mattered more to him than any amount of money on a table. David smiled at the answer, recognizing in it the same quiet integrity he remembered from Jackson's father decades earlier. For Amelia, something shifted in that moment, a slow and uncomfortable recognition that the man she had dismissed as a cheap contractor might be the only person in the building who had remained calm through the entire disaster. Jackson began the repair under the watchful eyes of David, Amelia, Madison, and the investors still gathered along the hangar floor. He removed the faulty secondary valve, cleared the contaminated line, installed the correct replacement, and recalibrated the pressure using nothing more than basic hand tools and decades of practiced patience. There was nothing flashy about the process, yet every movement carried a kind of quiet precision that made the surrounding engineers fall silent one by one. Lucas stayed close, finally allowed to assist openly, finding a strange relief in standing beside someone willing to be honest even when honesty was inconvenient. While the system settled into its new calibration, Madison used the pause to review the $12 million contract Connor had pushed through so forcefully 2 days earlier. Within minutes, she uncovered an indirect financial relationship between the outside vendor and a shell company quietly controlled by Connor himself. Amelia began to understand that her failure was not only technical, but personal. She had been manipulated by someone she trusted, someone positioned close enough to shape her decisions without her ever questioning his motives. The realization settled over her slowly, heavier with each passing second. Connor attempted to redirect the conversation, arguing that regardless of the underlying cause, the new system still represented a meaningful step toward modernizing the fleet. Jackson calmly disagreed, explaining that upgrading at the wrong moment had actually increased risk, forcing brand new hardware to operate around an old unresolved failure rather than alongside a properly functioning system. David instructed Madison to continue her investigation immediately, without waiting for a formal review process to begin. Lucas, finding his nerve at last, produced internal messages showing that Connor had known the $120 theory was credible days earlier, yet had pushed the $12 million contract forward regardless of that knowledge. The revelation struck directly at Amelia's pride. She realized she had chosen the appearance of decisive leadership over a careful technical truth, and that choice had nearly cost the company everything in front of the very investors she had hoped to impress. Jackson made no attempt to attack her further. He simply continued working on the aircraft, his restraint somehow making her shame even sharper than open criticism would have. Slowly, the hydraulic readings on the diagnostic screen began to stabilize. The red warning light that had haunted the morning's demonstration flickered, dimmed, then finally went dark. Everyone in the hangar seemed to hold a single collective breath as the pilot prepared to attempt the startup sequence once more. Connor's expression drained of color as the moment approached, fully aware that if the aircraft started successfully this time, every careful lie he had constructed over the past 2 days would collapse in front of the people whose trust he had spent years building. He glanced toward the exit once more, weighing whether leaving quietly might still spare him some measure of dignity, then forced himself to stay, unwilling to confirm his guilt through flight. Madison continued working quietly at the edge of the group, cross-referencing vendor invoices against payment records that had been filed under unrelated departmental codes. Each new document she pulled seemed to tighten the pattern further, revealing not a single lapse in judgment but a deliberate, repeated effort to steer Langford's spending toward companies that benefited Connor personally. She said nothing yet, choosing to build a complete picture before speaking. Amelia watched her father standing near the aircraft, his attention fixed entirely on the readouts rather than on the gathered investors who had once been the center of her concern. For the first time that week, she understood that the true measure of the day would not be decided by anyone's opinion in that room, but by whether a small, correctly chosen part had finally been allowed to do its job. The pilot initiated the startup sequence for the first time since Jackson had completed his repair. The system advanced cleanly through its first checkpoint, a small but unmistakable victory that seemed to ripple silently through everyone watching the control panel. Every eye in the hangar fixed on the display. Amelia's hands tightened at her sides, the practiced confidence she usually wore now replaced by something rawer, something closer to hope mixed with dread. The arrogance that had defined her 2 days earlier had quietly slipped away somewhere between the apology she had not yet given and the truth she could no longer avoid. The second checkpoint passed without incident, no warnings, no hesitation in the readouts. A moment later, the auxiliary engine engaged, its low hum rising through the hangar like a verdict finally being delivered after a long and uncertain trial. The Langford L900 ran steadily, fully restored in under an hour by a single safety valve that had cost $120. Investors who had stood in stunned silence only hours earlier began to applaud, quietly at first, then with growing conviction, not because of any polished presentation, but because they had just witnessed something far more convincing than a pitch deck. Jackson did not celebrate. He wiped his hands on a cloth, recorded the final readings in a small notebook, and asked that the technical team monitor the system for another 15 minutes before clearing the aircraft for an actual test flight. There was no triumph in his posture, only the same steady focus he had carried since the moment he first arrived. David asked him quietly why he had not fought harder to defend himself the day before. Jackson answered that in aviation maintenance, personal pride was never allowed to outweigh safety, no matter how unfair the circumstances surrounding it might feel. The words landed squarely on Amelia, who found herself thinking back to every choice she had made in favor of appearance over substance. Connor attempted to slip away from the gathering crowd, but Madison intercepted him before he reached the hangar door. She informed him, in front of enough witnesses to make denial pointless, that every contract connected to the failed upgrade would now be frozen pending a full investigation. Amelia faced the investors directly, something she had avoided doing all morning. She admitted plainly that the $12 million upgrade had never addressed the actual cause of the failure, and that the decision to pursue it had been hers alone to make and hers alone to answer for. It was, without question, a moment of public humiliation, yet it also marked the first real step in her becoming the kind of leader her father had always hoped she might become. She told the room, without hesitation, that Jackson Carter had identified the correct diagnosis from the very beginning. Jackson did not use the moment to humiliate her in return. He said only that the technical staff working beneath senior management deserved protection from blame for decisions made far above their pay grade, a statement that visibly moved Lucas and the other junior engineers standing nearby. David watched his daughter from a short distance, recognizing in her admission the exact lesson he had hoped this entire ordeal might teach her about leadership. As the aircraft rolled toward the test runway outside, Amelia turned to Jackson and asked him a question free of any trace of the condescension she had shown him before. She wanted to know what he had seen that everyone else in that hangar had somehow managed to overlook. After the successful test flight, David invited Jackson into the founder's old office, a modest room left largely untouched since the early days of the company. Amelia joined them as well, though her posture had shifted entirely from the commanding presence she had carried 2 days earlier into something quieter, more willing to listen than to direct. David spoke at length about Jackson's father, a gifted technician who had once been overshadowed by a larger corporation eager to take credit for a critical solution he alone had discovered. The injustice of that moment had never fully left David's memory, and seeing the same instincts in Jackson stirred something he had long carried in silence. Jackson had grown up understanding that the most capable people were not always the ones standing on a stage, but often the ones working quietly beneath an aircraft with grease on their hands and no audience watching. He had become a single father after a difficult family loss, raising his daughter on modest means, choosing contract work specifically because it allowed him the flexibility her life required. This part of his story remained gently in the background, mentioned only as quiet motivation rather than something shown directly, since his daughter remained largely off-screen throughout the entire ordeal. What mattered to Jackson was building a stable life for her, never by trading away his integrity for a faster paycheck. Amelia asked why he had returned at all after she had humiliated him so publicly the day before. Jackson explained that if he had stayed away, the aircraft might have continued to be repaired incorrectly, innocent technicians might have been blamed for failures they did not cause, and her father's company might have lost everything it had built. Amelia fell quiet, recognizing that Jackson had chosen to protect people who had shown him nothing but contempt only hours earlier. It was a kind of integrity she had rarely encountered inside corporate walls, where self-interest typically dictated every difficult decision. David slid the check for $120 million across the desk toward Jackson once more, this time without ceremony or audience. Jackson said he would only accept it if the money did not turn him into some kind of public relations symbol paraded in front of cameras. He wanted instead to build an independent maintenance company, one that would train young technicians properly and design systems built around preventing waste rather than rewarding it. David agreed without hesitation, telling Jackson that this exact answer was precisely why he had chosen to offer the investment in the first place. He had not been searching for someone willing to be impressed by a large number, but for someone who understood that real value rarely announced itself loudly. Amelia stared at the check resting on the desk between them, finally understanding that her father had not simply purchased the services of a skilled mechanic. He had placed a deliberate bet on an entirely different kind of leadership, one built on patience, honesty, and quiet competence rather than polish and spectacle. Outside the office window, the hangar lights still burned over the aircraft that had nearly cost the company its reputation, a reminder of how close everything had come to disaster. She thought of all the meetings she had sat through over the years, all the proposals measured by the size of their price tags rather than the soundness of their reasoning, and wondered how many smaller, quieter solutions had been dismissed before anyone bothered to test them properly. The thought unsettled her in a way she suspected would stay with her long after this particular crisis had passed. Madison completed her preliminary investigation within hours. The records showed clearly that Connor had pushed the $12 million contract forward despite knowing the underlying failure was likely tied to a single, small component rather than the entire hydraulic system. Internal messages further confirmed that Connor had deliberately worked to damage Jackson's credibility in order to protect a hidden financial arrangement tied to the vendor he had recommended. The pattern, once assembled, left no real room for an innocent explanation. Amelia confronted Connor in the same meeting room where she had humiliated Jackson only days before. The symmetry of the location was not lost on her, though she said nothing of it aloud as she laid the evidence across the table between them. Connor attempted to shift the blame back toward her, arguing that he had only ever tried to protect the company's image and that Amelia herself had signed the final decision. The remark stung precisely because it carried a measure of truth, and she understood she could not place the entirety of the failure on his shoulders alone. David remained silent throughout the confrontation, allowing his daughter to navigate the moment without intervention, trusting her to make the decision a genuine chief executive would need to make on her own. It was, in its own way, the clearest sign yet of how much he believed she could still become. Amelia announced Connor's immediate suspension, directing the matter to legal counsel and an independent auditor for full review. Connor grew angry, warning her that if the story became public, her own reputation would suffer alongside his. Amelia answered that a reputation built on concealment was never worth protecting in the first place. It marked the clearest turning point of her transformation, the moment she chose hard truth over comfortable appearances, regardless of the cost it might carry for her personally. She ordered an internal briefing for staff and a separate, more candid meeting with the investors who remained involved with the company. Jackson made it clear he had no interest in becoming a public relations tool for Langford's recovery story. He agreed to participate only if the company committed publicly to protecting its junior technical staff and overhauling the way major engineering decisions were approved going forward. Amelia accepted the condition without negotiation. Lucas was formally recognized for the evidence he had provided, restoring a measure of confidence he had nearly lost under Connor's earlier pressure. Madison began drafting the framework for a new partnership agreement between Langford Aviation and the maintenance company Jackson intended to build. Later that evening, Amelia stood alone in the now empty meeting room, looking at the chair where Jackson had once sat while she dismissed his diagnosis without a second thought. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of genuine regret. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into that room days earlier, certain that confidence and a large enough number could substitute for actual understanding. That version of her felt distant now, almost like someone she had outgrown in the span of a single difficult week. The lights of the empty hangar glowed faintly through the windows, the same hangar where a man she had once dismissed had quietly saved everything her father had spent a lifetime building. She picked up her phone and drafted a short message to her father, thanking him for letting her find her own way through the consequences rather than stepping in to fix things himself. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first honest thing she had done in days that had nothing to do with optics or investors. Amelia met Jackson at the hangar early the next morning, when the crowds had finally gone and no cameras remained to capture the moment. The space felt different in the quiet light, stripped of the spectacle that had defined it only days earlier. Her apology came directly, without the careful hedging she usually reserved for difficult conversations. She admitted that she had judged him by his clothing, by the modest price of his solution, and by her own fear of appearing weak in front of a board that valued size over substance. Jackson did not offer forgiveness easily or as a formality. He told her plainly that an apology only carried weight if the systems around it actually changed afterward. Amelia agreed, laying out 3 concrete commitments in response. Every major technical contract would now undergo independent audit. Junior engineers would have access to a reporting pathway separate from their direct supervisors, and Jackson's future company would hold the authority to evaluate root causes before any large upgrade could move forward. David finalized the $120 million investment that same morning, structuring it as a transparent strategic partnership rather than a simple personal reward. Jackson chose a name for his new venture, Carter Precision Systems, a quiet tribute to the discipline his father had passed down to him. A brief, gentle moment passed when Jackson received a short call from home, someone telling him that everything would be fine now that the difficult week was finally behind them. The conversation stayed simple and unembellished, offering only a glimpse of the responsibility that shaped so much of who he was, without placing anyone young directly into the unfolding events. Amelia witnessed the quiet sincerity of that call and understood, perhaps for the first time, why Jackson had never needed grand gestures to prove his worth. His value had never depended on anyone else noticing it. David turned to his daughter and told her she had just spent $12 million learning a lesson Jackson had offered to teach for free for the price of a single $120 valve. The words carried both sting and truth in equal measure, landing exactly as he intended. Before they parted that morning, Amelia and Jackson shook hands, not as chief executive and contractor any longer, but as 2 people beginning a partnership built on something neither title nor money could fully capture, a foundation of mutual and hard-earned respect. The hangar around them, once a stage for humiliation, now felt simply like a workplace again, ordinary and quiet in a way it had not been for days. Madison arrived shortly afterward with the first draft of the partnership agreement, already reviewed twice over to ensure nothing left room for the kind of hidden arrangement that had nearly destroyed the company days earlier. Lucas trailed behind her, carrying a stack of files for the new audit process, his confidence visibly restored after a week that had tested it severely. Amelia watched the two of them work together with an ease that had been entirely absent before, and recognized that this, more than any contract or check, was the true beginning of the change her father had been quietly waiting for. 3 months later, Carter Precision Systems operated out of a new maintenance facility built beside Langford Aviation, its bays organized with the kind of disciplined order Jackson had carried with him since his earliest years in the trade. Young technicians moved through training sessions that emphasized one principle above all others: always find the root cause before reaching for the expensive solution. Lucas became one of the first engineers to complete the full training program, eventually leading a small team of his own with a confidence shaped directly by what he had witnessed during those difficult days. Langford Aviation slowly rebuilt investor trust by remaining transparent about what had gone wrong and by reforming the process through which major decisions were approved. Connor faced formal legal proceedings in the months that followed, his case becoming something of a quiet warning within the industry about the dangers of greed hidden behind technical authority. Amelia changed visibly during this period, retaining her sharp instincts and polished presence, while learning to genuinely listen to voices from the lowest levels of the organization. A modest ceremony was held inside the same hangar where everything had once unraveled, deliberately understated rather than grand. David spoke briefly, telling the gathered staff that the future of aviation depended not solely on the most expensive technology available, but on people humble enough to notice small failures before they became enormous disasters. Amelia thanked Jackson publicly that day, though this time she made certain not to turn him into a marketing symbol for the company's recovery. She called him a partner who had saved Langford Aviation from its own arrogance, a description far more honest than anything a press release could have produced. Jackson watched the Langford L900 lift cleanly into a clear afternoon sky, climbing steadily without hesitation or warning light. He felt no need for revenge or further vindication. The quiet acknowledgement of the truth had always been enough for him. In a final, unhurried moment together, Amelia asked Jackson whether he had ever imagined a single $120 valve could change the direction of an entire company. Jackson answered that it was never really the valve that changed Langford Aviation, but the moment a leader finally found the courage to admit she had been wrong. The scene closed with David standing a short distance behind them, watching his daughter with quiet satisfaction, seeing in her at last the kind of leadership he had hoped she would someday grow into. The lesson of those few extraordinary days remained simple and lasting. That price was never the true measure of worth, that a title never guaranteed wisdom, and that sometimes the person everyone overlooks turns out to be the only one who truly sees what matters. Years from now, those who had stood in that hangar on the morning the aircraft refused to start would still remember it, not for the size of the contract that failed, but for the quiet certainty of a man who had never once raised his voice to be believed. Langford Aviation carried that memory into every decision that followed, a small, permanent reminder stitched into the culture of a company that had nearly lost everything chasing the appearance of strength instead of the substance of it. If breathtaking reversals of fortune keep you hooked until the very last word, stay with this story until the end.